Now I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming the fifth Chancellor of USC Upstate, Dr. Benny Harris.
Let's give our jazz ensemble another round of applause. I'd like to thank RJ for a great job as our MC and for his team for doing an exceptional job. Give our event staff and the entire team who are part of the Founders Day planning a round of applause for an exceptional program. The branding, everything just looks beautiful, so this is exciting. Also like to acknowledge our staff and our faculty and all of our students who are here for what they do every day to make this a wonderful place to be. And Chancellor Sansbury, thank you so very much for your leadership. We all stand on the leadership and the shoulders that you established here at USC Upstate. So thank you so much for being here. I'd also like to thank all of you, the friends and supporters of USC Upstate who have joined us this afternoon to celebrate the institution and our Founders Day Awards winner. Founders Day is a very special time at USC Upstate, a time to think back to 1967, when the Spartanburg Regional Campus first opened, and to 1975, when the school became a four-year university. In 1984, the university began offering graduate degrees. Now we are a thriving campus with more than 5,000 students on more than 300 acres and make an economic impact in the region that exceeds $625 million each year. In 2021, I had the honor of being named the fifth chancellor to lead this institution, a job that gives me the platform to fulfill my purpose, which is to inspire and develop young people to change the world. For more than 5,000 students, 700 employees, 35,000 strong alumni network represent the best and brightest, guided by a desire to pursue and support higher learning that leads to life-changing careers and improves our state. They will not be able to pursue their dreams without the support of people we are celebrating today, the recipients of the Founders Day Distinguished Service Awards. These awards, sponsored by the Spartanburg Higher Education Commission, celebrates individuals that have made outstanding contributions to our institution, playing a vital role in enriching the legacy of USC Upstate. You have helped make USC Upstate a leading regional public university that changes lives. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce someone who has also changed lives. If I can get my phone without these, what y'all call those calls that? Spam call, because I have something in here about you that I want to share, but the spam call got in the way of that. I normally hear about this from my wife later. She had already told me to slow down and don't tell people I said to slow down. She said, just do it. So I just violated the second rule that she gave me. But I can do it because of the speaker who's coming, Governor Dave Beasley, who makes everyone feels like a best friend. The Honorable Dave Beasley served as South Carolina's former governor. I recently had the joy of interviewing him for my podcast, Below the Line. And in that time, I got to know him. It was one of the most engaging interview and experience I'd ever had. I felt like I could sit at his feet all day and just listen to him talk about the wonderful experiences. He was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives at the age of 20. So that's the reason I think it was so amazing when he agreed to participate in the founding event of the Chief Justice Judge Beatty Center for Justice and Society and talk with our students. In 2003, he received the John F. Kennedy Profile of Courage Award from the U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy for representing the South Carolina legislation that removed the Confederate flag from South Carolina State House. In 2017, Governor Beasley was appointed as the executive director of the World Food Program and went on to win a Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the organization for its efforts to combat hunger. And so when he asked me what it is that I wanted him to talk about, I asked him if he would talk about that work, because that work was so phenomenal in terms of what he's doing to make an impact across the globe. Earlier this week, maybe even yesterday, I wrote to our USC Upstate community, and I shared a story that I'm going to share as he prepared to come up. And the story was, there was once a man who spent his life wandering between villages, never staying too long in one place. One day he came upon a river with a powerful current. He managed to cross it, though barely. Instead of continuing on his journey, the man stopped, gathered wood, and began building a bridge. A traveler approached and asked, "Why are you building this bridge? You have already crossed the river." The man smiled and replied, "Because one day someone else will come to this river, someone with fewer resources, someone more afraid. They will stand where I once stood, wondering if they can make it across. The bridge is not for me, it's for them." Please help me welcome the Honorable Governor Dave Beasley, a bridge builder.
Benny, these devices, I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. This is mine. You're not taking mine. So you got yours.
That's yours.
No, that's mine.
It looks like mine, though.
It's got my mama on there.
But it's my wife right there.
We were in a United Nations Security Council meeting. It was a very, very intense, and it was a blackout. I mean, nobody could be in it. It was a very serious discussion. In Russia and the U.S. and China, it was a bad situation, and I was having to talk about some pretty consequential stuff in a particular region of the world, and very intense. And the United States was responding, and you could literally cut the room with a knife, the tension that was there. And the U.S. ambassador that was speaking in this closed session of the United Nations Security Council said a word that activated Siri. And all of a sudden, Siri started talking, and everybody started laughing. And it was the greatest thing that could have happened. I've never seen Siri really do anything good before, but that day it cut the tension. So these things I was telling these young future leaders, Madison and Zachary, earlier, this is going to bring an end to democracy as we know it today because of the disinformation, misinformation, and the manipulation by extremes on both sides. And it's this generation that we are preparing today that are going to find the solutions so that we can move forward. As I remind the young people, you need to understand, because there are a lot of young people out there today that want to tear down everything without an appreciation and understanding how we have built to where we are today. 200 years ago, when the world's population was 1.1 billion people, 95% of the people on planet Earth were in extreme poverty. Today, when over 8 billion people, less than 10%. So we have built systems, organizations, programs that's sharing more wealth, helping more people than any time in world history. But try telling that to the 10% we're not reaching. We don't give up on them. And with all the wealth that we have today, there's more fluid wealth than any time period in world history. And the fact that we still have people starving, children not having clothing or shelter, shame on us. So we must not stop. Let's not tear down what we have that's reached. Let's correct what can be improved, but let's make certain that we do what we need to do to reach that final 10%. When I got that phone call, Benny, in 2016 about taking over the World Food Program, it was from a liberal atheist left-wing friend of mine from Canada that I had done some work with in the Kosovo War and in Sudan. And he was a good friend. And I had just left the U.S. Senate meeting. There was a group of senators that have been meeting since 1942, every Wednesday morning, 8 o'clock, off the record. Nobody's allowed in it. And they pray together, Democrats, Republicans, and they lay aside their titles, man-made titles, and they walk into this room as brothers and sisters, equal to one another. And I had just left meeting with them, and this friend called, and I had gotten a call about going to the Trump transition White House team near the White House about talking about international issues. This was December of 2016. And I decided I would walk. I had a beautiful Wednesday morning, about 50 degrees, and it was sunny. And instead of Ubering or taxiing, I thought I would get some exercise. And my phone rings, and it's my buddy. I said, "Hey, Bob, what do you want? I know you don't call just a chit-chat. What do you want?" He said, "You know, we're scared of Trump." This was 2016. I said, talking about the UN. It's a big UN guy. I said, "Well, you should be." You know, we laughed. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Are you going to take a job in the administration?" I said, "No, I didn't do it with Bush, who was my best friend. I have no intentions." "So what are you calling me for?" He said, "Will you take a senior role in the United Nations?" I said, "Bob, I'm not your UN kind of guy." But the night before, my wife had said, "The world's in trouble, and leaders like you need to re-engage." And I said to her, "I know you're not asking me to get back involved in politics, and especially Washington politics." She said, "No, just don't knee-jerk react and say no without giving it some thought and prayer." So that hit me, and I said, "Bob, what are you thinking about?" He said, "Well, the United Nations World Food Program, UNICEF, yada, yada." I said, "Bob, I'll call you back." So I hung up, and I called a Democrat congressman who was one of my prayer partners from Ohio. He had been the ambassador to the World Food Program. It's like a board of directors. And I said, "Tony, tell me about the World Food Program." And I said, "I'm not looking for a job. I don't want a job." He says, "Oh my God, if there's God's work on planet Earth, it's the World Food Program." I said, "The United Nations World Food Program?" You know, kind of joking. He says, "Yeah." So I talked to some senators. They said, "You've got to do it. You're the only one that can talk Trump out of vetoing strategic international aid. You've got to do this." And I said, "Guys, I don't want it. Let me talk him out of it, yada, yada." Well, anyway, you know, years later, greatest decision ever made. There's no greater joy than helping the poorest of the poor. Now, what I think you need to think about in Founders Day is that why are we where we are today in America, in Western civilization especially? It's because we have built the systems, the professors, the institutions, and challenging and inspiring and encouraging the young to be the future leaders. Oh, and I can remember many a day with you and Tony and so many of you down at the Capitol talking about the future with Horace Smith and so many old friends and T.W. Edwards, doing what's necessary to bring rule of law and systems and transparency, the things that make a society responsible and help improve the quality of life. I have seen probably more destruction, war, and conflict than about any human being on the planet. When I took this role, we were feeding 80 million people on any given day, week, or month. I thought that I could put the World Food Program out of business. As a governor, you set goals, objectives, measurables, execute a plan, and you do it. Only to see it get worse because of man-made conflict, climate shocks. And in my first year, the number went from 80 to 135 million. And I had to raise an extra few $1 billion to do that. And I was able to convince Trump, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, I called it the miracle on Pennsylvania Avenue, and I was able to bring the Democrats and Republicans together when they were fighting on everything possible. But we brought them together, but unfortunately the numbers were getting worse. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, COVID hit. Supply chain disruption. $3.7 trillion lost by poor people around the world in lost income. And yet the richest of the rich increased by $1.7 trillion. If you remember that famous tweet that was heard around the world that I zeroed in on Elon Musk. And that he and I went back and forth about that. That's another discussion for another day. But Elon got engaged. He didn't give me the money that I wanted. He put money up in his own foundation, which CNN did a pretty blistering story on today, but Elon's a pretty smart guy. I like Elon, even if you're not going to get involved with us, get in the game. Because you're not going to solve poverty by charity alone. It's the private sector being empowered and inspired by the government, by our institutions, that we're going to solve the problems of the poor. No one's raised more money, I don't think, in the history of the world than I have. I raised $55 billion, $39.2 million per day in my last year. So if anybody's raised more, I want to hear it. I don't say that arrogantly. I say that because I have seen what happens when charity is the only approach. We must continue to build the systems to reach the poorest of the poor so that they can take care of their own families. And if you want to learn about capitalism, you give an African woman the same tools you give a man. I have seen it firsthand. We've empowered more women in Africa than any organization, operation on the planet. It's amazing what happens when an African woman gets the tools she needs to take care of her family. I can share story after story, and I remember Biba. This is in Chad, and I had a rule of thumb whenever we would come in and, not just hand out food, but how do we put down water systems so they can grow their own food, nutritious food, and feed their own families, sell into the marketplace, buy the clothing, the medicines, and change a way of life. And I went back 2 years later, and we had put down the water systems, irrigation systems, the lines, and she stood there with the gardens, the community gardens, and all the women, they share and share alike. And he said, Mr. Beasley, we're feeding our families. We're selling into the marketplace. We're buying our clothes for children, our medicines for our children, and I just paid for my son's wedding. Harvard Business School couldn't have touched that. It was so beautiful. And that story is modeled all throughout when people are given the tools. Because one thing I learned when you're feeding 160 million people, because see, it got worse. You thought COVID was bad enough, and not many people realize that the United Nations World Food Program, we are the supply chain mechanism for moving COVID supplies. We don't carry just food. PPE, testing equipment, ventilators, the whole 9 yards. When the airline industries were shutting down, we were gearing up. Largest airline operation in the world, I was told at the time. But then when you think it couldn't get any worse, because the number went from 135 million to 250 million people, 270 million people marching towards starvation, not chronic hunger. That's a different discussion. People who don't know where the next meal's coming from. These are the people that are addressed with famine and death and destabilization and mass migration. Because if you can't feed your children, and you have no degree of peace, you go do what any mom and dad would do. You're going to find it somewhere. And what we would find in our surveys, whether it's Syria or Guatemala or Venezuela, people will move 2, 3, 4, 5 times in their home country before they'll leave their country because they don't want to leave home. But if you can't feed your children, your instincts will kick in. And so the number went to 275 million. And you think it couldn't get any worse? Well, Ukraine. Breadbasket of the world. Grows enough food to feed 400 million people. I was buying half of my food from Ukraine. When you're moving enough food to feed 160 million people any given day, week, and month, you're moving a lot of supply chain. And all of a sudden, the Black Sea shut down. And I went into Odessa and did that famous tweet that was heard around the world on Putin. Don't bring famine to Africa, and we negotiated the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But the numbers spiked to 350 million people. And I was then raising 30, 35, then $39 million a day. And when I thought I could put the World Food Program out of business, it went the other direction. Why? Brokenness, division, matters of the heart, greed, corruption, the things that you and I take for granted. What I learned, though, and I talked about this in my 2021, I think I'm the only person that's ever, starting to sound like Donald Trump, I think I did a 2020 Nobel Peace Prize speech, but it was cut short because of COVID, and then they allowed me to come back and do a full speech. So I've given 2 Nobel Peace Prize speeches, which is pretty cool, and maybe I should tell this story. I told it the I think a few folks earlier. Should I tell that in? You know, you don't get that phone call often about the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, it just doesn't happen. And I was in Niger, and that morning we were out in the countryside on the west side of Niamey, the capital, where ISIS was about 10 miles south of us and Al-Qaeda was about 10 miles north of us, and they were disrupting supply chains, because if they could disrupt supply chains, that meant food and medicine couldn't move, which means people would starve, and they would recruit using food and medicine. That's how they recruit, one of the ways, aside from other ways, as you can imagine. And so I knew if I could get food through this corridor, but the military was blocking me out of fear of safety, and I was trying to convince them that, look, my operations are 80% in war zones, whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, Yemen, Syria. We know how to do this, and we do it well. Get out of my way. And if you don't get out of my way and don't allow me to move that food, you will collapse, destabilize, because Al-Qaeda and ISIS will have recruited so much, you're not going to be able to stop it. So I'm pounding the table with the military general about 10:30 that morning, and my phone's upside down on the coffee table, man. He's just buzzing, blowing up. And the president's sitting there, and the president and I were good friends of Niger. And by that time, somebody busts in the room. And it was my guy, and I was looking at him like, I am going to whip your butt. What are you doing walking in here? And he said, Nobel Peace Prize. He exclaimed it. And I'm like, oh, yeah, who won it? And he said, you did, you know. And so who's the first person you want to call when you get something like that? It's your wife. Well, I was in Niger. She was in Texas. 3 in the morning. You ever get a phone call 3 in the morning, Mom, Dad? You going to the jailhouse or to the morgue? Well, I didn't know it, but she had a dream that night, which she doesn't have these kind of dreams, but that I was killed in Niger, which very likely. And so she answers the phone, half asleep, knows it's me, and I go to say Nobel Peace Prize, but I choke up. So here's my wife, 3 in the morning, with this dream. Her husband's choking up on the phone, trying to say, I love you before I die. Finally, after probably 12 or 13 seconds, which seemed like an eternity to her, I say Nobel Peace Prize. Oh, that's all, you know? No, she didn't say that. But one thing you learn, and I talked about this in the Nobel Peace Prize speech, is that the number one problem that I have seen around the world in all the countries that I've gone to is division and brokenness. And you also learn that people are really the same. They want the same things for their families. And what's the answer to that? Obviously, love is the answer to it. But the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, whether you see Jesus just as a man, just as a prophet, or just as a savior, of love your neighbor as yourself, is the most powerful weapon in the history of the world. There's not a single leader that I have met with in private that I have not talked about the teachings of the Spirit of the Almighty, and not one has ever pushed back. They want to learn more because they don't know what to do. But you really begin to understand in Genesis where it says we're all made in the image of God. When you're on this part of the world and that part of the world, and you're from nation to nation and ethnicity and culture and religion and differences of color of our skin, and you begin to see that we are all made in the image of God. And I never understood the depth and the consequence of loving your neighbor as yourself, which is the greatest teaching. You can ask any rabbi, any sheikh, a Muslim teacher, or Christian teacher. What's the greatest teaching of all the Abrahamic religions? And literally all religions on the earth. It's love your neighbor as yourself. The golden rule. Doing to others you have been doing to you. It transcends all religions. But I never appreciated that until this rabbi who teaches for the Pope in Rome, where our headquarters was. Great pasta, by the way. But we loved Rome. You don't want to do business there, but it's a great place to visit. But anyway, this Jewish rabbi who teaches twice a year on the Jewishness of Jesus, he said to me one day, because he heard me talking about love your neighbor as yourself. He said, you know, the more accurate translation of that, of the ancient Hebrew, is to love your neighbor as your equal. And it dawned on me that every human being is made in the image of God. So love your neighbor as your equal, because we're all equal. We're all made in the image of God. You want to end racism? You want to end sexual discrimination? You want to end all the divisions of isms? Then see every human being is made in the image of God. So when Jesus said, when I was hungry, you did not feed me, boy, it took on a whole different medium, because that's the image of God. And when you deny that child, you're denying God. So when Jesus was asked that question, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and strength. And the second is like it. I didn't understand that. Love your neighbor as your equal, because you're made in the image of God. When you love your image, when you love the image of God, you're loving God. And it's like, wow, how can I miss this? And regardless of your religious perspective, can you imagine the practical consequences of loving your neighbor as your equal? Imagine if we just did that in our neighborhoods. And by the way, Jesus never asked anybody to change religions. He wanted you to change your heart. And then he said, hello, brother. Hello, sister. Hello, friend. Imagine if we would just walk like that, talk like that, think like that, act like that. It's that simple. But my goodness, in the religion world today, the Baptist Jesus doesn't talk to the Catholic Jesus. And the Republican Jesus doesn't talk to the Democrat Jesus. And the Shia Jesus certainly doesn't talk to the Sunni Jesus. Now, this is not a religious discussion. This is more of a spiritual. Quite frankly, I'm fed up with a lot of religion. But I'm not fed up with spirituality. And young people today are so fed up with religion, but they're not fed up with spirituality. They're yearning for it. And we need to get back to the basics. And there's no more powerful demonstration of that by loving your neighbor. We have people in Spartanburg, in South Carolina, that are struggling and suffering. I ask you today to get back to the simple basic. Billy Graham gave a speech one time to a bunch of pastors. I don't remember the exact words, but he said something that upset some of the conservative pastors. And the pastor stood up and said, Dr. Graham, if we do that, it'll set the church back 150 years. Mike, you remember this? It was something like that. Mike Hamlet, y'all know Mike. Mike's been a friend for a long, long time. And Dr. Graham says, I'm sorry. I apologize. I didn't mean to do that. I meant to set it back 2,000 years. You know, Jesus changed the entire world by getting some ordinary men and women in the neighborhood. They weren't from Yale and Harvard, Oxford. They were from Boiling Springs, Lamar, South Carolina. Places just like here. And he taught them how to love each other unconditionally, break bread together, have prayer together, be in fellowship together around the Spirit and the teachings of Jesus of love your neighbor. Can you imagine what would happen if we would just get back to that? Calling each other brother and sister, helping our neighbor. I ask you in the next week, go break bread with somebody that might be a different color than you, a different church, a different political persuasion. Now, don't talk politics. Just get to know them. They might be poor. Go read my Nobel Peace Prize speech in December of 2021. We talk about this. It's what we need in America today. Yeah, there's a lot of division in Washington, but we need a lot of healing, spiritual healing in America. I have hope. I told these young people earlier today, y'all give me hope. You know, all the darkness in the world can't put out the light of one little match. 2 matches, 3 matches. You got a whole university campus, Benny, of incredible young people that are ready to be the light of the world. And we who've gone before you don't want to snuff it out. We want to inspire you and encourage you and reach out to your brothers and sisters that may be different than you and love them unconditionally and yet hold each other accountable, because I think we're losing our way, but yet I still have hope. So, Upstate, Olin, thank you for your dedication years. Tony, Cynthia, the fact that you put up with Tony this long is amazing. Many, many great friends in this room I haven't seen in a long, long time. And Rick's dad, Alvin, I remember the first time I sat down with him in 1993, and I was running for governor. Went by the old place, and y'all sold it then. Your dad died a few years ago. Great, great memories up here in Walnut Grove. You know, Alexa Newman, who has her Carolina Pregnancy Center across the street over there, and great memories. I brag and carry the spirit of Spartanburg with me all over the world. Young people, if a little boy from Lamar, South Carolina, die to yourself, let the Spirit move through you, and you change the world. Blessings to y'all. Thank you.